Yes, yes. Welcome to the ancient world of tabletop games. I am Agamemnon from the historical documentary Time Bandits. This is a report from a fugitive. In my video for the Papercraft Lodge model from Rime of the Frost Maiden, I added a gelatinous cube to provide a sense of scale. The gelatinous cube is not the most ludicrous creature torn from the pages of Dungeons & Dragons. No, that dishonor goes to the Dungeon Master, an unkillable foe with a challenge rating of Infinity +1. The Dungeon Master is protected by a massive indestructible energy screen, and is known for bribing hardy adventurers into not killing the Dungeon Master by allowing their very world to continue existing on a weekly basis, sometimes midweek, if the calendar allows. And that is a role-playing fact. The gelatinous cube appears in the monster manual, except that it doesn't appear in the advanced D&D monster manual. Oh, it's there, but you can't see it until it attacks you. By that I mean the creature isn't illustrated. I meant to say you can't see it unless it attacks you. How remiss of me. As we move through the editions of D&D, we find there's a tendency to give the creature a hint of a tint as production values evolve. You'll even find a high-tech version of the gelatinous cube over in Starfinder. The assembly ooze is the gelatinous cube in space, and don't let anyone tell you different. The science fiction version is suitably silvery. Here's a gelatinous cube. If you want to be technical, the creature is an athcoid. This is the official model from WIZKIDS. Almost everyone paints this thing green or blue or aquamarine to fall somewhere in between the two main colours. Realistically, if you want to save time, you don't have to paint it at all. It is almost undetectable to the human eye until a fight breaks out, even in a brightly lit room. So the shortest painting tutorial is all about not painting it. Use it straight out of the packaging. The figure is hollow and comes with a base and a treasure insert. This creature attacks by engulfing its foes. Does it have foes? Victims? Does it have victims? It is a magical dungeon cleaner, designed to fit inside a 10-foot wide, 10-foot tall dungeon corridor. The creature travels from place to place, gathering up dungeon debris, fallen adventurers, deceased goblins, shields, scattered coins. This beastie is quite neutral in its approach to combat. It beats as it sweeps as it cleans, then it digests and dissolves and destroys. The model is designed to reflect that. If you aren't going to paint the model, at least paint the metal treasure depicted on the insert. I'm still in two minds about how to paint the insert pieces. If I paint the goo different colours, I can easily determine which cube is which in combat. That is, heaven forfend, should the poor players find themselves fighting more than one cube at a time. When a player's character is eventually engulfed by the cube, slap that character's figure onto the insert and drop the cube on top. Clearly, and I don't know how many puns about transparency I can use here, don't want to be transparent about it, clearly this arrangement works best with character figures from the same product line. A WIZKIDS figure trapped inside a WIZKIDS gelatinous cube has a good chance of fitting quite well. You'll find difficulties with winged figures or spellcasters employing elaborate and space-consuming spell effects. Slightly larger figures fit inside the cube without the insert. You get much the same visual effect. I'm not saying the enterprising dungeon master is only going to attack a character based on that figure's ability to sit neatly inside the cube, but it wouldn't surprise me. That passes for comedy at many a gaming table. Of all the miniatures available for Dungeons & Dragons, the gelatinous cube is the one most reasonably replaced. Just use a plastic box. However, of all the miniatures available for Dungeons & Dragons, the gelatinous cube is the one that benefits most from being upgraded. In the days before this sort of accessory was available, you used a piece of cardboard that fit the scale of your dungeon and moved it along as the creature engulfed players. I mean, characters. Imagination fuels the game, it's true, and you needn't use miniatures at all. Yet, the threat of this mobile dungeon mop and bucket, this living vacuum cleaner, hell, the threat of it feels more threatening if a figure is trapped within its quivering form, especially if it's your figure trapped there. How should you paint the cube? You shouldn't. Leave it in its near-invisible mode. If you want to follow an army of painters in turning the cube vaguely blue or blue-green, how to go about it? You don't. I didn't use paint at all. Instead, I used ink. And I didn't even use ink at first. I experimented, just in case the project turned into a disaster. This is paint medium. Mixed 50-50 with water and 1 drop of washing up liquid, the medium creates a fluid that will make your acrylic paints go a lot further without noticeably reducing the strength of the paint's colour. It also works quite well with ink. I wanted to add contrast to these wooden player boards for the board game Eldritch Horror. Storage is always a problem. If only I had a gelatinous cube of my own to deal with needless packaging and the occasional irritating human. I said that out loud again, didn't I? There'll be a video on constructing the Eldritch Horror storage crate. That crate came in wooden boards. I used one of the boards as a testing ground for ink on wood. The inks took to the wood reasonably. I felt I'd get more coverage out of the ink if I mixed it with my painting medium. On the topic of that formula, it's all done by syringe into a bottle. These tiny bottles hold about 15 ml. Be real though, you never get that last milliliter. Even aiming for 7 ml of medium to 7 ml of water is asking a bit much. Allow for that extra drop of washing up liquid, and add a bit of space for agitators. What are agitators? Paint settles in layers within a bottle, given enough time. Agitators aid in prolonging the paint's shelf life. These agents of mischief sit inside the paint bottle and swirl the chemical goo around when shaken. You might add stainless steel bearings. I prefer to use glass beads. So-called stainless steel depends on the truthfulness of your manufacturer. If the metal isn't stainless, you'll end up with rusty paint. These glass beads are listed in the fine print as made of faux glass pearl. They look suspiciously plastic. Without grinding a bead up, it's hard to tell. Typically, I drop 3 plastic beads into a bottle and then add my own alchemical mixture, cap securely, and shake well. After wild experimentation, I've decided 5 ml of water in a syringe goes into the bottle with 5 ml of the medium, 1 drop of washing up liquid, and 3 agitators. I scoop the water out of a bowl using another syringe, and I take the drop of washing up liquid from one of these small bottles, not straight from the product bottle, as it has a larger opening in its substandard mass-produced stopper. About the water, here's a much larger water bottle. It comes from a tumble dryer. The level of impurities in your water will vary depending on your distance from some top-secret government installation. Tap water is safe to drink, but I wouldn't thin paint with it. What you are after is deionized water, which is a fancy term for water that is sold at inflated prices. Let us say distilled water will also suit our purposes. You can buy distilled and deionized water products in supermarkets. This large plastic container on the table tells you that I took the water from the tumble dryer. If you drink coffee and you make use of filters, then pour the water from the bottle through a coffee filter. You have all your ingredients to hand, measured consistently. That way, if your Frankensteinian experiment works, you can repeat your success based on your measurements when next lightning hits your drafty castle. 3 agitators in the small bottle. Distilled water follows. Painting medium goes next. 1 drop of washing up liquid to finish. Seal it up and shake. There's your painting potion. With this mixture, you'll make your paint or ink go further. That's one way to thin paints, acrylic paints. I hesitate to call this mix a thinner, even though that's what it is. It'll thin your acrylic paints. With my experience using enamel paints, I think of a thinner as surgical spirit or white spirit, turpentine substitute, methylated spirit, products along those lines going by different names throughout the world. The really smelly poisonous stuff that will strip the air out of the room you are in. For the Eldritch Horror player boards, I opted to use my acrylic thinner with ink. I took a wild guess on the coverage required and dumped 6 drops of ink into a palette. Then I sprinkled 6 drops of the painting medium into the palette for every drop of ink there. I stirred the mixture with a cocktail stick until it went from milk to red or black or whatever ink I was using at the time. The mixture was just right for the project in terms of the colour mix itself and the overall amount of liquid available. Mixing ink with medium or mixing acrylic paint improves the flow with little to no reduction in the strength of colour created. How did I manage when it came to painting the gelatinous cube? Well, I inked the gelatinous cube. That's the top tip. Don't use paint at all. I erred on the side of caution and mixed a batch of green ink and medium. No harm done. I'd have used straight ink for this job, but I had something in mind. My plan was to ink the inside of the cube and not the outside. I'd see how the mixture settled. This is a cube of animated ooze, that's what I told myself. Any awkward settling of ink could be explained away as part of the creature's anatomy. Loading up the brush with the mixture, I set to work. This has to be a large brush to cover as much of the interior as rapidly as possible. I left the model to dry. After half an hour, I noticed pooling and settling here and there. I cut a cotton bud in half and manipulated that inside the cube by holding tight with a pair of tweezers. Fiddly as hell, but I covered 1 or 2 patches I'd missed by trailing the excess pools into the underdone areas. Then I left the model for a day. When I returned, I saw that the hazy tint was just that, hazy. The model needed something in there for purchase, and there wasn't much, but now I had a vague layer of ink in there, acting as an undercoat for the main layer. Going back in, I resolved to use the big brush again, and ink without the medium this time. That's the strength of colour you see here. The pigment took more readily a second time around once the inner surface was prepared. There isn't much difference between the strength of the green with medium and the strength of the green just using ink. That's the point of the acrylic thinner. You're improving flow while maintaining roughly the same level of colour. Why paint the inside of the cube? Seemed obvious to me. Wear and tear and handling is reserved for any figures engulfed on the inside of the model. If you paint on the outside, the whole of the exterior is exposed to the usual elements. Players and their gaming ways, in other words. The outside of the model is already shiny, glistening, and looks as a gelatinous cube should. If you want that shiny look back after painting the outside in acrylics, you'll have to add a layer of varnish. Layer on layer, the more layers you pile atop this piece of plastic, the less you'll see of the inside of the model. Avoid disaster. Paint as few layers as possible. Use ink if you feel comfortable with that. Brush the inside and not the outside. Don't add varnish. It's a mite trickier to paint on the inside than it is on the outside. The advantage of painting the inside is that you can paint the whole of the interior in one rapid session. To do that when painting outside, you'll need to brace the model with your fingers inside hanging onto the edge where the hole is, or paint in stages and let as many sides as possible dry at the same time, and then go back in and paint any corners you were holding the model by. I went straight to the idea of painting the inside of the cube. With ink to hand, ink felt preferable to paint. That's how I painted this one. On the inside with ink in 2 coats. And this one. Oh, and this one. Oh, that one too. Why buy 4? I wanted 4. You can use them as magical barriers, or things that aren't gelatinous cubes, you know. By sheer coincidence, I just bought a dungeon with 4 gelatinous cubes inside it. Well, it would be a shame not to use these in that adventure. Insert evil cackle here.